In today's session, we're going to be digging into what's new in Azure Storage. In terms of agenda, we'll be talking through what we're hearing from you as customers and partners in terms of what are your current priorities with this unique situation that we're all in terms of IT and just the way the world is operating these days. We'll dig into the Azure Storage portfolio, and we have some new product announcements that we'll talk through. We are living in unprecedented times in terms of how we work and how we live. In terms of IT, we are seeing years of transformation to cloud, years of digital transformation that is happening on the order of months. Working from home, working from anywhere, that is a massive trend that we're seeing at incredible scale and at incredible pace. With that, there are new requirements on enterprise IT in terms of securing enterprise IT assets for work from home scenarios. Business continuity and disaster recovery are even more in focus than they were 6 months to a year ago. And then, of course, with the rapid pace of digital transformation, there is a dramatic acceleration of migration to the cloud. And as those workloads move to the cloud, it's even more important for enterprise IT to optimize those costs as those workloads are running in the cloud. And of course, storage and data, those are concepts that are front and center with respect to all of these customer priorities. On this slide, we're going to talk through 4 of our customers who are using Azure Storage in a way that highlights the current priorities that we talked about on the previous slide. So we have Kona, which stands for Coke One North America. We have Johns Hopkins, Smiths, and Centara. Kona is using Azure NetApp Files to migrate their SAP HANA datasets from on-prem to get all of the performance and scale and reliability of NetApp ONTAP using our Azure NetApp Files, which is NetApp ONTAP delivered as a Microsoft first-party service. Johns Hopkins is using a solution provided by our partner Commvault, and they're using Commvault with Azure Storage in Azure to back up petabytes of data sets to Azure Blob Storage in our cloud. Smiths has moved data sets from on-prem, and they've moved them into Azure Data Lake Storage, where they're able to take advantage of all the elasticity and scale of Azure Compute to derive rapidly additional insights from the data models that were previously on-prem. And then we have Centara, who's using the best in the industry disk solution in terms of performance and scale. They're using Azure Storage UltraDisk to move those on-prem data sets to high-performance disk storage in the cloud. Of course, we have many enterprise customers across many different industry verticals who rely on Azure Storage for all of their enterprise IT needs for their most mission-critical applications. And this slide is representative of just a small set of those enterprise customers. Okay, let's dig into, from left to right, Azure Storage and what it includes. Azure Storage includes block storage. We have a block storage solution that we call Azure Disk Storage. We have an object storage solution that we call Azure Blob and Data Lake Storage. We have 2 different file solutions today. We have Azure Files and we have Azure NetApp Files. And then we have a native backup solution to back up your virtual machines and many other Azure services called Azure Backup. And we support the ability to physically transport using Microsoft provided hardware appliances or hard disks. We can move large data sets from on-prem into our cloud through Azure Data Box and our Azure Import Export service. In terms of Azure Storage scale and performance, we deliver best-in-class cloud storage. This is a data platform that is operating at exabyte scale. We have multiple exabytes today that are under our care on the Azure platform. We have hundreds of trillions of objects and hundreds of trillions of transactions that we process every month on this hyperscale cloud storage platform. We have unique solutions with UltraDisks, Azure NetApp Files, Azure Backup, Azure Data Lake Storage. All of these solutions are operating at incredible hyperscale. So now let's dig into some platform capabilities of Azure Storage again, with respect to the customer priorities that we talked about on the earlier slide. So first, let's dig into the remote work scenario. We'll talk through a use case that is highly relevant to everyone that's working from home. This use case has to do with taking your entire Windows desktop environment that was on-prem and then centralizing that and moving that into the cloud using Windows Virtual Desktop, which we're seeing many customers do today. And the adoption of Windows Virtual Desktop has gone up dramatically with COVID. Windows Virtual Desktop, when combined with Azure Files or Azure NetApp Files, it makes WVD much easier to deploy and manage. It gives you that on-prem perf, but in the cloud, and it gives you the least TCO when it comes to your data sets. And we provide the best compatibility of all cloud providers with respect to our cloud file solutions in comparison to what typical enterprise customers use on-prem with SMB, NetApp ONTAP, Azure Directory integration, and support for ACLs. And of course, with WVD, these are scenarios where there are large data sets for customer documents. There are probably large file shares that need to be migrated into the cloud. And then there are, of course, end user profiles that can be managed via the FS Logix user profile service that's included as part of WVD that integrates very well with Azure Files and with Azure NetApp Files. Let's dig into security and some of the unique capabilities of Azure Storage when it comes to securing your data assets in a world of remote work. First of all, we have a service called Azure Private Link. What Azure Private Link does, it takes an Azure virtual network that you've probably already created in order to connect from on-prem into the cloud, and by private link enabling your virtual network, all of your Azure storage assets, as well as assets associated with other Azure services, are only available to end users that are part of that virtual network. So it limits the access to those resources only to be available within a given virtual network. And then further, as your end users are accessing those data resources from within a virtual network, they can accidentally or maybe even maliciously move those data sets from outside of a given virtual network out onto the internet, for instance. So Azure Private Link, it protects your data assets when accessing those assets remotely into the cloud. Encryption is super important, especially when it comes to data. Microsoft Azure supports encryption in many different ways for accessing data, as well as supporting data at rest. Specifically, this slide focuses on data at rest. With respect to Azure Storage, we support 256-bit AES encryption with customer-managed keys. You control the keys. If you want to revoke access to your data sets, you can revoke those keys. And your data is encrypted regardless of whether or not it's running on one of our very hot storage tiers or one of our more cost-effective and efficient lower storage tiers. Let's dig into business continuity and disaster recovery. Azure Storage has always had the leading set of solutions when it comes to DR. Our object storage platform supports point-in-time restore, so we can restore even a subset of containers or blobs within a storage account to some previous state. We support versioning of your data assets. With block storage, we support incremental snapshots, the ability to restore a single VHD directly to an empty disk. And then with file storage, we're now happy to announce that with Azure NetApp Files, we support volume snapshot policy. So for an individual Azure NetApp Files or ANF volume, you can have independent snapshot policy to automatically create volume snapshots. And then we're also glad to announce that with Azure Files, we now have Azure Backup support, built-in native Azure Backup support in GA for Azure Files. With respect to business continuity across regions and zones, by virtue of the Azure platform being in more regions around the globe than any other cloud provider, that gives you the ability to replicate your data sets from one region to other regions around the globe. We support natively as part of our blob storage platform. We support native object replication across zones. We also support the ability with GZRS to support global replication of zone redundant storage. So with ZRS, you get the ability to have your data sets span multiple data centers within a region. With GZRS, you get the ability to have that data replicated from one region to one of our other Azure storage regions. In block storage, we're able to support cross-region copy of blocks so that only those deltas are moved from one place to another for additional regional-based resiliency. And then with file storage, again, we're happy to announce the support for cross-region replication, the ability for an Azure NetApp Files volume to be replicated from one Azure region to another Azure region. This takes the local reliability of NetApp ONTAP and introduces cloud reliability with cross-region replication. At this conference, we're happy to announce that Azure Backup Center is now available in public preview. Azure Backup Center gives you the ability to have one place that you can go to manage all aspects of our native backup offering in Azure. With Azure Backup Center, you have centralized support for backup governance, for backup monitoring and operations, as well as to get insights of how your workloads are being backed up and whether your workloads are being backed up into the cloud. All the way back to the beginning of Azure Backup, we've supported infrastructure backup for scenarios like Azure Virtual Machines. Now at Ignite, with Backup Center, we're supporting customer workloads. So we're moving from infrastructure now to support PaaS in addition to infrastructure. We have support for SQL Server, SAP HANA. We have support for Azure PaaS services like Azure Files. And at this conference, we're announcing public preview of support for the Azure Postgres service, as well as support for Azure Blobs, natively built in now as part of Azure Backup and available to you as Azure Backup Center. Let's dig into a really important topic, especially in these times. Moving data sets or migrating data sets from on-prem to the cloud is very much in focus for our customers. And of course, Azure Storage is front and center with respect to cloud migration and the movement of on-prem data sets to the cloud. Azure Data Lake Storage, Azure UltraDisks, and Azure NetApp Files, they all provide unique storage capabilities for migrating enterprise-class workloads. Azure Data Lake Storage. Azure Data Lake Storage gives you the ability to take your on-prem HDFS assets and to move them into the cloud to a service that supports HDFS natively. We are the only cloud provider that has a native HDFS implementation built into our storage solution, and we are the only true enterprise data lake storage platform. So if you have a data lake strategy, we encourage you to take a look at Azure Data Lake Storage. Azure UltraDisks is designed to support your most data-intensive and transaction-heavy on-prem workloads and to move them seamlessly into the cloud. SAP HANA, with its high IOPS requirements and throughput and sub-millisecond latency, along with other enterprise workloads, are a great fit for UltraDisks. And of course, Azure NetApp Files, we've talked about a few times in this presentation, gives you the ability to easily lift and shift, especially NetApp ONTAP workloads and those volumes, into the cloud. We have some announcements at Ignite to talk about with respect to object and file storage migration. In public preview, we now have the ability to have true multimodal access to blob storage. Previously, you could support, or we supported access to blob storage data sets through our blob APIs, of course. Later, we added HDFS storage or HDFS access in the form of Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. At this show, we're now happy to announce that you can access those same data sets using NFS 3.0. You can bring your data into the cloud using NFS, let's say, and then you can access it using HDFS or blobs or vice versa. We're also happy to announce that with Azure Files, we now support NFS 4.1 in public preview. We supported SMB access going all the way back to the V1 of Azure Files. Now we support with NFS 4.1, full POSIX compatibility for Azure File Service. And then finally, in GA now, we have for Azure NetApp Files, the ability to access your data sets through SMB as well as NFS v3, and to do that concurrently for the same data sets. That enables you to save storage time and, to save storage costs and also reduce operational time with this dual protocol support. In terms of block storage, we have some announcements as well to talk about. Azure Shared Disks is now in GA. We are the industry's only cloud provider to support both Windows and Linux-based applications with clustering support using shared block storage technology. For UltraDisks, now in GA, we have the ability to support the unique requirements of legacy databases like Oracle and Sybase that have unique requirements in terms of page sizes. And then finally, many applications, especially new applications, are being developed based on container technology. Those container-based applications inevitably have state, and we're building more awareness and more intrinsics having to do with stateful containers into the Azure Storage Platform as well. And so the capabilities mentioned on the slide, like bring your own key and so on, they are now available in GA. Like we talked about, as your workloads are moving more rapidly into the cloud, it's essential that you be able to optimize your costs so that you can move them to the cloud and do so in a way that works from a cost as well as a performance and capability standpoint. With respect to optimizing costs, the ability to move data sets up and down different workloads and to do that automatically in some cases is really important. We now support tiering and lifecycle management for object storage, block storage, and file storage. And we have some specific announcements on this slide that we'll go through. In GA, we now support Azure Data Lake Storage and Blob Storage tiering. We have in public preview the ability through automatic policy to move data sets based on the last time that they were touched or accessed. In block storage in public preview, we now support the ability to move your block storage data sets within different price performance tiers, just like you've been able to do in object storage with blob storage for some period of time. And we support disk and VM bursting, which enables higher IOPS and throughput when you have spiky workloads or cyclical disk traffic. So you don't have to always provision or pay for peak. With respect to file storage, now with Azure NetApp Files in public preview, Azure NetApp Files will automatically move your volumes up and down across different price performance tiers. And then with Azure Files, we now support hot and cool tiers for Azure Files. And so you can have those less frequently accessed data sets. They can be moved down to a lower price performance tier, which helps you with your overall TCO. A key area of innovation for us is the ability to bring more query compute down directly into the Azure Data Lake Storage Platform. This reduces your TCO because it means less data needs to be moved up to the analytics tier, and it increases the performance of your queries. It accelerates your queries, in fact, by computing over your data directly on the Azure Storage tier. This is a capability that we're enabling as part of Azure Data Lake Storage and the storage tier again, and it's supported through deep integration with services like Azure Synapse, so that there's a nice relationship between native Azure Analytics services and the Azure Storage tier underneath. We're just getting started with query acceleration for Azure Data Lake Storage and expect more innovation along these lines over time. To recap, we are in unprecedented times with COVID and the way that we're all now working as individuals and as enterprise IT. We've talked through the trends related to remote work and how Azure Storage can play a key role with respect to supporting the rapid transformation of on-prem data sets into the Azure cloud. We've talked about unique capabilities along those lines related to securing those data sets, to enabling BCDR scenarios, to accelerating the migration of those enterprise data sets into the cloud, and then finally, the ability to optimize your costs once your data is running in the Azure Cloud Platform. To learn more, I encourage you to check out these links. We have a lot of great content related to Azure Storage. Thank you so much for viewing this session on Azure Storage. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for using our product.